today's talk is in the general region of wholeness, but on the whole issue of adaptive connectivity. And the thing about this, now how can I scroll forward? Oh, there, just click. Good. You get used to one way of technology working and then it catches you out and you have to go back to old methods that you'd forgotten about. So here we are, the whole irony of adaptive connectivity, but it's really a pretty good lesson for us all as things, we just have to change as things go along. And I come to you today on one thing that doesn't change is the respect I hold for the Wurundjeri people who were previous, First Nations people that lived with this country rather than on this country, and they held deep respect for how they lived on the country, with a view to keeping it safe and well and generating for future generations. And that is, the kind of respect that I think that we as a humanity generally and individuals in particular will do well. And I know I'm speaking to the converted here, but good lessons from our First Nations people on how to live for 60,000 years on a piece of land and with a piece of land, and keep it surviving well for future generations. So what's our priorities? Well, I was once asked that question, and I was asked this question when I was in America, and I said, well, my first priority is my wife. My second priority is my children. I didn't have grandchildren then. And my third priority is work. Oh, he says, well, and he was a fellow that worked at the one of the naval research laboratories, but he was also a part-time counselor and pastor. And he said, well, look, I wonder if we could just explore the nature of your priorities, because one of the things that if Vicky is your first priority, what if Vicky changes? Because change she will, and change she has. And I wonder really whether, he said, that what you want to continue to regenerate is the nature of relationship. And it got me really thinking around the freedom that then gives for each of us to recognize that we change, but that what we need to adapt is our relationship between the two parties, right? Because 9 years ago, I don't have a cell in my body that was still there 9 years ago, to my knowledge, right? But by and large, the human body regenerates even those, the very long nerve cells within the central nervous system every 9 years. And some, regenerate daily as we knock off skin cells and the like. And so this whole idea of got me thinking about, well, my first priority is actually my relationship with Vicky, and not Vicky herself, because that gives, freedom for change, as I was talking about. And my second priority is indeed my relationship with my children and grandchildren. And we've seen this photo before, one of our absolute family favorites, shot on the beach in Dubai, because it captures 3 generations in the one, and then provides you know, that nature of the relationship and the longevity of it, you know, from the past through the present to the future, and that notion of priorities in terms of that sense. And then and look at this fellow here, Joe, and my third priority is my relationship with work. Part of that work has indeed brought me into contact with a wonderful range of people who present here today. And here's Joe and I. We were doing our work at the World Engineers Convention in Melbourne in November last year, talking of all things about sustainability, and the importance of complex systems governance to strengthen systems thinking and engineering. And that was an absolute joy, right? But so it's my relationship with work. Now, I do remember, you know, I was asked when I joined Booz Allen Hamilton, and they were opening an office here in Australia, and they picked 7 people, and I was lucky enough to be one of them. But in my interview, the partner from America, he said to me, "So what's your priorities in life?" I thought, well, I know the answer to this one. My relationship with Vicky, my relationship with my children. Didn't have grandchildren. No, I did have one. My relationship with my children and my relationship with work. Tell me about the third one, he says. Which really then told me a lot about his focus on how things as a whole fit together, because we cannot pull ourselves and separate ourselves from the environment that is part and parcel of our being. So that should have told me a little bit about that world that I was entering into. And I left it 6 years later, and I left it after the incoming managing director for Australia had said to me, because I'd gone to him with this issue of staff development. He says, "Richard, we don't do staff development. We get them in, we burn them out." And you go, "Well, right." But anyway, 6 years of hard experience before I heard that from the horse's mouth. But it's this thing about relationships is something that we don't talk a lot about. We talk a lot about the parts, but not about the connection between the parts. And that's really what we're about today. And of course, it's how in that we get to regenerate value. So what is it that my priorities tell me what I value, and how I conceive them, and then how I seek to contribute, and then how I count the value, and I can measure that in terms of the nature of the relationship, and in terms of the relationships with other people from the work situation, and how indeed they then help propagate and add to the thinking and action that we get engaged in. Which brings us to the issue of viability. And this is part of the journey that we're on still today, as we have been this last couple of webinars. And the question for this webinar is still the same as the question for the last webinar, but we're going to go a little bit deeper. So how do we organize around value and do so viably and for life? And I love the way that I comes forward, because it forces us to look deep into our soul. Now, so last week, we just had a look at who we are, what we do, and how do we know, and the relationship amongst these parts. And indeed, the purpose is driven by what we do, not by the value that we add. That is the consequence of what we do. And of course, we can each place ourselves within that model. right? And think in terms of the value we add, and that there is an important connectivity amongst that. But an important element that we mentioned last week that's important to just recap on before we go deeper is the whole notion of Ashby's law of requisite variety, which really, acknowledges that there's far more variety in the environment than we are able to produce in our own self or in our own teams in order to match that variety. And Ashby's law of requisite variety really says that it's the variety is the only thing that trumps variety. So that's always going to, we talk about a world of complexity. Ever it was thus, right? Because the world has far more variety than we will have in and of ourselves. And the job really for the management then is to look at how to amplify or constrain the variety available to those who are doing the production, right? Keep the focus on the ball as to the difference we want to make as the consequences of our actions. So, cool. And one of the main management tools, of course, is policy, and particularly where that is value focused and goal based, because then it ties what the management framework values and has a direct relationship to the value that's seeking to be delivered. But then you look at the issues of production in between. And that indeed, when they're value focused and goal based, we can ask the producers as to how they're going to meet the goals that are available, because they have more variety at their hands than the management team in order to deliver the value into the planet. So let them say how best to meet it, and then leave them to do that with as much freedom as possible, as much elbow room as possible, because that gives them more variety. And the management role comes back to assuring, in the sense of, did you guys, people, and I use that term generically, but I'll need to get it out of my vocabulary. Did you people actually do what you said you would do? It's not checkboard stuff. And we can see ourselves in there, and we can place, our ecological anchor as being this century's focus, and think about the social good from which we can achieve some profit. We can place our teams within this context and think about our management within that. And I noticed it was just this last week that Prince Charles had made, an address, and on the issue of sustainability. But something he said really stuck with me, and I'll read it to make sure that I get this right. But he said, we have to come together as a world on this. We have to develop an approach which, by putting nature at the center of the whole process, what profit we make, we have to also make a profit for nature, by putting something back so that my and your children and grandchildren have some kind of future, because we're literally compromising it with the way we're going right now. And I think inherently we know this, but by and large, how do we change and get people to adapt? Well, where we're going today is into the conversation of how do we have a conversation around the relations amongst the parts, and to do that and really understand how the connectivity and the relationships between the parts is really as important as the parts themselves. And of course, we're going to run into problems, because news will have to be passed up that isn't palatable. even like putting the planet before the economy. But nonetheless, we've got to deal with that and present with that with a values-based, that's, you know, honest, transparent, mindful of the whole, that we're working together, that we're doing what we say we do, and that we respect each other's contribution in the process. And that, you know, good management then, in the sense of this viable system, is that it creates the conditions for leadership to emerge at every level. So I'm not talking about leadership here. And I think too much of the management conversation has gone to the leadership and overlooked the importance of management, because in management, you're dealing with the relations amongst the parts. As good as new directions are, relations amongst the parts need to be managed. As dear Professor Stafford Beer recognized, at the heart of enterprise lie the laws of viability, but so too with human beings. And he said, as I mentioned last time, that management is the profession of regulation and therefore of effective organization. So let's dive into it. And this will be entirely familiar, I know, for Joe and Peter, who have been through, you know, a long professional career in the systems world, as it may be to others. Let's start first with understanding what is the difference we want to make, the impact that we're having, as well as the impact that we'd like to have. And we can have a range, multiple impacts that we think about. But, you know, in terms of the work that we do, what we do, and let's just think about this perhaps to give it context. In terms of a medium-sized business that would have a number of lines of operations with different units, each having some impact into the environment. Well, the first thing that happens is that they will then work in their own teams, but if there's no regulation as such, then you're not going to get the synchronicity needed, depending on, you know, the relations between the units, as various production processes have demands from one unit to feed into another, and then that needs to wait until something else comes along, and then they're integrated and so on, and then that impact can be had. So in order to achieve that, then there is some level of management. And these numbers that are attached to this draw a relationship straight back to Stafford Beer's work in the Viable Systems model. And he just referred to them, well, each of these unit A to unit N would be system ones. And then those above, and we'll get to the system twos. I'm just going through this in a different order to the way he would describe it, to say, well, you need some management function over that that's indivisible from it, that has a view of the whole, that really understands what's in the terms of needed to create the impacts that this little business is seeking to make. But now, in order to do that, they need some sort of assurance function, some way of actually exercising a regulatory control or production control over those units in order to get the sequencing, the synchronicity, etc., for them to have the desired impact. Fabulous. Can't do that in isolation. Well, I hold that thought. And part of what we'll see through this is that some consistency in the processes and the sequencing, etc., will appear. But that's part of the assurance function that will come through. Now, for them to be able to achieve that, then there needs to be some feedback by way of, well, what is and how are things progressing, and is it within tolerances, and so on and so forth, that meets the assurance line. And so it completes the cycle in terms of that assessment function. And we all know, that you can't manage it if you can't measure it. Well, yes, but they're not just quantitative measures, right? And we'll have to go back to thinking about that framework of measures and how we can use Balding's hierarchy of systems complexity to really appreciate that there's some measures with unitary, where the currency is calculation, some elements that are adaptive, where the currency is experience, and some measures that are interpretive, because we just can't know, and the currency is judgment. So it's really how then we integrate all of that is the challenge within this channel. So now, if that were the end of the process, then the focus of the delivery units would constantly be seeking to improve and the like over achieving the impact. But it would drive short-term thinking because there's huge variety out there in the world. Enter then a planning function that sort of goes, well, what's happening in this world, right? Let's seek to understand, prospective future demand, our aspirations, etc., and the current demands upon us, because what we've got may not get us to where we need to be. We need to think about building capability if we're going to actually go into a different future. We need to think about the ways in which we do things, not only just what we do. And we need to think about how we change our measurement systems to keep in tandem with that. Super stuff. But this too calls for, it can't be done in isolation. And too often we see planning units separate, up in headquarters, well away from those who are actually creating the good that the company is actually delivering. So planning cannot be done without a fair understanding of the constraints upon the business right now. And then through that planning process, seek to allocate resources, priorities, and restraints, etc., over the management that then will flow through. But what happens there? Well, excuse me while I just have a little drink. What happens is this: the reductionist world that we're living in, with its concepts around no limits to growth, keeps pushing bigger and bigger top lines, seeking bigger and bigger bottom lines. So you get acquisition of companies to grow top lines and the like. And it's driven largely then towards short-termism, right? Because of this need for growth. And it's a mindset that can only be broken if, upon this complex system, and any business that has 2 or more people is a complex system, but think of, a small business of 50 to 100 people, a medium business, 200 to 1,000, or a large business, up in the thousands and tens of thousands, then this is a complex business that needs complex systems governance. But what does that do? Now, Beer calls this, System 5. And each of them just get their number. And if there was one word that typically is attached to System 5, it has been policy. But policy for me misses the mark. It is part of the problem, not the whole problem. So it suits a reductionist world. It suits a top-down world just to have policy, right? See this? These are the rules, follow the rules, get on, crack on. Oh, and while you're at it, keep generating more profit. Boom. And so the sense of value from the top is in the rules that they put down on them. But what's missing, though, is the importance, and Beer, Beer recognized this, but it's just largely forgotten in the practice, is that a large part of this governance function is making sure that you get the right balance between managing today and planning for the future, right? And that's the hardest part. But if ever we are to get the impacts that we need in this world, then this governance function, this part of the governance function, needs to rise and play a much bigger part than it currently does in many businesses. And what we've got here now then is around, you get viability by the flow of information and energy in the way in which organization any organization is organized to do this. And that indeed, we'll get into the fractal nature of this in a moment, but I can look at that in terms of how I govern, plan, manage, assess and assure what I am producing and doing today in order to try and have some impact in the world as a consequence of my actions. So it's a model that will work for individuals, it's a model that will work for teams, but it's about understanding the flow and where the blockages can occur. And one could segment off, not segment off so much, but actually look at those that are now in this blocked shaded area as being, as Beer would put it, the brain of the firm. Because this is the cognitive stuff, the thinking that is done in relationship to the action and the doing. And it's not one being more important than the other, albeit the sense of hierarchy in business today would say that the thinking is more important than the doing. But if the thinking isn't paying attention to the consequences of the doing, then the thinking is missing the mark. And that, by and large, is where the biggest failures occur. If there is a breakdown, it is that bad news doesn't travel up. There's consequences, and people are often not at liberty, for fear of the consequences to their own promotion, to take bad news up. Or if they do, whistleblower. How many whistleblowers? That's the career limiting moves. The whole notion of taking bad news up when you know it's not going to be well accepted is what causes this breakdown, but yet it's the most crucial element in getting good governance over the planning and management of any organization. Which brings us all the way back to where we started in this conversation 7 webinars ago, around having some sense of value. And what are the values one carries with you? That honesty and transparency underpin everything in order to be mindful of the whole, to work with others, to do what you say you would do, and be respected, even though you may be carrying bad news up. And this is, one of the biggest failures, but it's also one of, therefore, the biggest opportunity we have for improving any business today, right? many a time, and it puts effectiveness ahead of efficiency. Many efficiency drives will take out a layer of management and then squeeze the lemon on those doing the work in delivering operations, right? Lean Six Sigma, where do they start? Down in the operations end. No, all right. That's not true. They do start with the concept of value. But when their concept of value is tied to the dollar, then efficiency squeezes operations harder than anything, and there is zero redundancy because it's characterized as waste, which then loses the mindfulness of what's needed in any business. So how to improve the process of integrating, because these are indivisible functions. And this is something that, you know, we need to think about is stop breaking these connections in this model that is absolutely crucial. And, you know, organizations will become adaptive and their agility will increase if every indivisible function operates as a system in a larger system. So let us think then, I thought I was going to another slide, but I imagine it will come. I cannot see it right now. Let us then understand, before we get into that system of systems, really, and it's really building the nature of the systems, is that this works for the individual, and how we make sense of the world and what we do has consequences in the world for what we're seeking to achieve. How we work within teams, within our businesses, within our communities, within our practices, to actually contribute to the impact that we wish to have, and do the same at the industry, national, international levels. And that this is really then the building up of the value, but it's the same model that flows through, right? This is me being the producer. How am I going to govern, plan, manage, assess, and assure what I do today in order to have some impact and some consistency of message in what we're delivering into, not we, me, into the world, you know, just through this today. Fabulous. And then indeed how we work, you know, in this collective, even in this conversation, and think about the systems that need to be in place for us to be able to provide levels of control over the production. Well, better actually to go back to the corporate example, and then indeed at the third iteration of this, how indeed the regulatory framework is set with its goal-based, value-focused element. Then the important thing, the connection between these, it's not that each of these other levels aren't producing, they are producing. But remember the thing about management, it's about producing the conditions for which leadership can emerge at every level. And at the higher level you are, the further you are away from the production end, the more important it is to actually get down and see the production end and walk the shipyard, as Dr. Bradley has told me that it was a regular activity for him as a Navy captain. Because it lets you see how the regulatory frameworks that are being put in at the higher levels are then being applied through systems of governance, systems of planning, systems of management, systems of assurance, systems of assessment that are having some impact then over the production of the impact that their organization is seeking to have. And once again, we've got this flow and the consistency of the assessment, so that Top down, it's relevant to the bottom. Bottom up, it's accurate and transparent to the top. That the assurance, the goals flow into systems that enable the achievement of those goals, into the production of the impact that the organization is set up to deliver. So it's these indivisibility of functions, and this was the slide I thought was a little bit earlier that nearly threw me. The indivisibility of the functions, so that across that complex enterprise, the fractal nature of it, what is the system of governance? What is the system of planning, of management, of assurance, of assessment? And not just the system of production, which is where most systems are focusing on. Planning not done as an individual activity or as a small team activity, but a system of planning systems. And that's where, as we come to looking at the framework of any of these planning systems, any of these elements, the parts, the 6 parts within this: govern, plan, manage, assess, assure, deliver. The system of governance, we have a framework from Boulding that enables us to realize, well, actually, it's a social activity that does reach into the transcendental as we think about the unknown futures that we're trying to achieve. And what is it that we need to have in place, from the frameworks through to all 9 levels of systems complexity, that sets the requirements for a governance system, and how that may then be designed to suit the context of any business. Then take that framework again and apply it to the system of planning systems. Take that framework and apply it to the system of management systems, and so on. It's about repeating of the same patterns, but understanding the relationships between the frameworks. Both are relatively simple in and of themselves, but the power comes from the relationship between them and the fractal nature of both. So ultimately then we can get into adapting our thinking into how we measure and become more adaptive in measuring, rather than over the measures we are using. Measures are transient. Measuring should be permanent. And indeed, it need not, you know, the dynamic complex system governance of, you know, need not be the stuff of science fiction. I'm not sure that's the actual enterprise itself from the series, but where we're trying to go with this now today is, you know, picking up our concepts of holism, was to go deeper into what is the functional indivisibility and the adaptive connectivity of the parts. And we've done that through having a look at 6 verbs and the relationships amongst them, because this is what we do. And who we are and what we do have the relationship between them in terms of defining our purpose. But how we practice that with the value set that we hold gives us our distinction, our distinctiveness. So these 6 verbs can be taken and not be a cookie cutter solution, because it depends on the who and the values that the who, the people, carry with them in the conduct of these. And next time, we'll dive into the other side of holism, the structural divisibility, but begin to look at, so how do we actually, so we know this, we now know, we've got the model for how a viable system comes together. How then do we structure our notions of value? And for that, I'm going to bring in a bit of systems engineering modeling around why, what, and how. And I can use a Navy example, which began with the question of, well, why do we need defense in the first place? What does defense do? How does it do it? And part of the answer in the what was the maritime effects that they wish to create. Well, why have a Navy? What does a Navy do? How does a Navy do it? And then so on down through that. So that's just a little bit of a glimpse as to where we'll go in looking at structural divisibility, so that we get real ideas of the value that's being contributed by this, and use that as a basis for structuring, not just because actually I like running, a governance and risk section, so perhaps we'll have one of them. So you know what I stand for, and that is for continuous learning. So I look forward to continuing the conversation and opening the mics as we seek to unify this. This will be contributing to my book. This one's out on the streets. There is a first chapter. Mine is the first chapter, and 17 other good contributions that each of which can be mapped back into that model. And I'm pretty sure we've all connected, but if we haven't, let's do so. And thank you so much. Now I need to stop sharing. Trinza, are you able to do that? Stop share. There we go. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to be with me during that walk through the viable systems model, which is me casting my take over over Stafford Beer's work, and I'd welcome any thoughts, feelings, questions, or ideas as to how it resonated with you.
So Peter has made some comments in the chat section, Deb.
Yeah. You don't need to address them at the moment. Some of them are just comments that were observations that I made while you were talking.
Oh, well, thank you, Peter. I always enjoy your contribution there. Is there any one of the four that you'd want to, be worthy of others engaging with?
No? It'd be interesting to see how, because it's been a while since I've visited the VSM. Yeah. And I must admit your interpretation of it could be it's a lot easier to follow than when you've first been going in first, boots and all to start off with. So.
Well, that's one of the things that it's unfortunate that Stafford Beer's work has been found to be, hard to access, and that's because he's been really quite precise with good reason in his construction of this, and it will see it, the longevity of his thinking move forward. And because we know for sure that right now that the International Society for Systems Science regards the viable systems model as the one systems model that's most deeply based in science and biology, and therefore, something that they could build, a systems science around. I also like it because it's replicable.
It's also interesting to try and maybe put it into a systems of systems context.
Totally, which is where I go with that, a system of governance systems. And Joe and I and our friend Professor Chuck Keating have written a few papers, co-written a few papers with other authors as well on this through the International Council for Systems Engineering and other places. So that whole notion of complex systems governance is crucial. I think looking at a system of planning systems and so on is equally important. And we did some work in Navy again. It was wonderful. It just showed how, yes, they lost the capability, but immediately opened themselves to all of the, ideas available. And one thing that they then built with assistance was a notion of collaborative planning, as if planning could be anything else, to a systems scientist. But it was really important to break the connection that planning is done in the office of the Chief of Navy. No, right? Yes, there's a captain up there, but there's also captains at fleet, there's captains in the submarine force and other forces, and there's all of the support. Then there's captains of industry that also contribute, and it's the collection and the relationships of the whole that ultimately need to be brought into play. So what does that system of planning look like? It's like, in the digital world today, how for those that, supercomputers are pretty hard and expensive to come by. But you can use get enough laptop computers and use the reserve capacity. Now, I'm no whiz kid on any of that stuff, but I'm led to believe that, it's the use of so many millions of little bits that really help provide that super capacity that exists. All it needs is some change in the process and the software of how you engage with all of the little bits. And that's sort of what we're talking about here. What's the connectivity amongst the parts, and how can you adapt your processes? Bolding hierarchy level 5, how can you adapt your processes to actually make better use of what you've got?
I'd say, Richard, I find it interesting as a zoologist, sitting back and watching humans try and reproduce nature and then come back and then look at it all the time in terms of the connectivity of the little parts and the impact that a single organism or a single species can have on the whole ecosystem. And them using all these terminologies is just, it's, I've been doing it for, I suppose, nearly 50 years now. So it's always interesting.
Yeah, you have, Graham. And for those that don't know, Graham and I, went to school together and through uni and then reconnected thanks to social media. But this whole point, and again, perhaps that's also a tiny illustration of how good seeds can pop up again, with time and with the right conditions, which gives me hope. But how do we get the people who have been trained in ecological thinking, like yourself, Graham, zoologists and others, systems thinking engineers, like Joe, and I know you're already engaged, but there's so many that aren't. And here's the superpower that we could create by bringing those together and fusing them with the current concepts of management and getting that, some adaptive connectivity amongst the management of our businesses, govern, plan, manage, assess, assure, and get those working better then that gives rise to the conditions for leadership to emerge at any level. And I think then we'll get, you know, potentially exponential change.
I agree entirely. Yeah. I mean, and part of the problem is the human nature to try and create their own little fiefdoms and their own structures. And that goes, I mean, you know, nations is a classic example. It's lines drawn on bits of paper by bureaucrats, you know, often not even up to the natural. They often don't even use rivers or mountains or physical barriers. They, you know, nobody knows where the border between South Australia and Victoria is. You know, there's not a line on the road that says you've crossed the border. There's a sign that says you're now in Victoria and you've got to go 100 k's. But apart from that, you know, it just seems that humans have this need to be able to control, and I think we need to understand that we are an animal. I mean, I'm always have been against this whole concept of zoonotic diseases, because, you know, every disease we have is a zoonotic disease because, unfortunately, we are an animal.
And every issue that we're dealing with is a systemic issue.
Exactly.
Every single one. It's not just racism. It's not, you know, inequality and gender pay and so on. Yes, they're systemic issues, but so is the buying of a MacBook computer, because the bloody thing didn't do what I wanted it to do today. But there we go.
And you can take that a step further, Richard, and say, and then all of those issues are constantly always changing. So it's always flow.
It is
never static.
Flow, quite so. And I think therein is the issue, you know, and why I go back to those same 6 value points. Yes, you've got to be mindful of the flow. You've got to be mindful of the hierarchy and nature. There is a hierarchy in nature. So, you know, these management gurus that are decrying hierarchy, and it's being mindful, though, of how that's structured by value. And that's where we're going in the next webinar. That then, you know, enables flow to occur right to the top of the organization. And it used to be so. It used to be so. I remember my grandfather, he was a shipbuilder in, you know, as an apprentice during the First World War, except for the time when he ran away to try and join the army. But that aside, he then came down after during the Great Depression, because he was out of work. Britain wasn't building as many ships as Korea anymore. And that's where people were going for shipbuilding. And he ended up in the aircraft industry, which in 1930 was still pretty young. You know, it was absolutely nascent. And so they didn't really understand. They were still learning the physics of flight. They were still learning how the physics and the engineering needed to come together. Planes would fall out of the sky, you know, right through to the 1960s, and even today now with software controls on the 737 MAX. But it's far less frequent. But back then in the 1930s, whilst my grandfather was foreman, he knew Mr. Goodenough, the head of Saunders Row at Cowes, who would actually come down and talk with all of the foremen to understand how the whole was coming together and what were the constraints. Because if they weren't fully aware of those constraints, people could die. And they knew that. And this is just what we've got to get back to. That way of working that enables the little bits of information at the bottom, or the concerns or the worries, to be heard and sense made of them. That's not, you know, and we've got other ways of doing that today with digital technology and the like, but that shouldn't, in fact, we should be wary of that to make sure that that we get the signal out of the noise.
And it needs to enhance, not and
yes,
collaboration is the way to go. I mean, digital technology is fine, but people use it to control again, because you can filter stuff and things like that. So if you're a middle manager and you don't want your boss to know that you've got dissension in the ranks, then you're not going to release it. But you need it so that also connectivity, that the people at the top understand, as you said earlier, the values that everybody has and adhere to them, and not go off and do something different.
Right. So, but this is where digital technology can help. Sorry, Joe. Just by tracking the flows, right? Just as we track our parcels. Oh, look, that bit has been stuck on Graham's desk for a long time. I wonder what the issue is.
Agree, but you have open and transparent software around, but people don't want to use it because they lose control. That they have this thing where they just don't trust it, because people could find out actually what they're doing.
Yeah, well, that's really where it needs to change. Joe, you were
so I've been listening because this is interesting. So Caitlin. So Caitlin, so the Assistant Secretary of the Navy for our research, development, and acquisition has, before COVID, he had this monthly get-together off-site in Alexandria in a warehouse where he encouraged anybody to come to it. So Caitlin shows up and she gets a selfie taken with the ASN. It goes on her Facebook page, and then it makes its way into LinkedIn, at which point the company CEO, our company, our former company, throws a fit because his juniorest engineer, and yes, she's a PhD, but his juniorest employee is meeting with the Assistant Secretary of the Navy, and he's terrified what she might say to him.
There you go.
And so the reaction that came out of that, was very interesting, and that actually marked the day that I knew my time at that company was limited.
There you go. Yes.
Because to me, it's like, holy mackerel, Caitlin, because, oh, by the way, she and Hondo exchanged emails and connected together on LinkedIn. So, so I'm like, God, woman, you've got a pipeline right to the Assistant Secretary. And if we need it, we got it. Instead, the CEO's terrified, goes in and apologizes to the PEO who works for the ASN that his employee got out of the box, and the PEO's looking at him like, "What are you worried about?" Because he knew Caitlin. So it all really comes, a lot of it, not all, but a lot of it comes down to how do you react and how do you think about it? Because if you think it's a good thing, you encourage it. You want that kind of connection to happen.
Yes.
If you're terrified because of whatever reason, you want to try to stomp it out. And
it's a tough one to get out of, but perhaps by good people leaving, then
they have no clue. They have no clue. They have lost 7 people in the last year, and the folks who are left have no clue why we have left.
Oh my goodness.
Yes, and it's actually pretty scary when you think about it. They have no clue, and in at least 3 cases, they were overjoyed that troublemakers left. And I think they were surprised because all of us have gotten newer and better jobs.
Yeah,
I mean that's so
amazing.
But
though the longevity of that company, one would think, would be much shorter than if they'd actually embraced that and applauded her.
So there's a pool, because it is a small business. There is a pool.
Yeah.
As to how long it has left as an independent company.
Yeah. There you go. Wow. Fabulous. I'm very conscious that I've just skipped over the hour. And I do want to respect people's time, and thank you all once again for joining us and for an engaging conversation afterwards. Thank you, everyone.